Welcome back to Keeping Ag Real. This is Jenny Schweigert. I'm a mom, wife, chauffeur, sheep and cattle herder, front porch obsessor, and your host. Welcome back to Keeping Ag Real. As always, thank you for listening. Today's guest is Nate Birt, content manager for an initiative spurred by Farm Journal. We'll be discussing the upcoming Trust in Food Symposium scheduled for January 23rd and 24th, just ahead of Top Producer. And then we'll be talking about the entire initiative, Trust in Food. If you are interested in attending the event, you can go to trustinfood.com. Well, welcome, Nate. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Jenny, thank you so much for having me. Excited to visit with you today.
I'm excited to work with you again on a slightly different project, and you're in a different role now, and it sounds like this is really a great opportunity for Farm Journal and for the entire agriculture community.
Oh, you're exactly right, Jenny, and it's so encouraging, as we've been building the Trust in Food platform at Farm Journal. I've spent quite a bit of time just looking at the landscape and seeing all of the various efforts that are underway in our industry to really get closer to the consumer and to help farmers and ranchers and growers, document their conservation practices, sustainability, animal welfare, and improve those things. Farmers are people who really want to grow their knowledge to become better business people. And so the chance to be able to assist producers and go alongside them and also work with the broader supply chain is just so worthwhile and so much fun. So you're exactly right. It's a really great time to be in agriculture.
I understand that you've spent over a year, 18 months, analyzing and formulating a strategy to address the key drivers of consumer trust. Can you give a high-level view of the entire program?
Sure, absolutely. So the Trust in Food platform is really built on the notion that there needs to be more of a relationship between all of the links across the food supply chain and, most importantly, to the consumer, because we understand that consumer food preferences are changing, the way consumers want to engage with their food and understand how food was grown and produced and raised. And so that means that the entire supply chain has a responsibility to have a cohesive message and to make sure that those great responsibilities that consumers give us are being met, whether that's environmental stewardship, whether that's treatment of workers and labor, treatment of animals, all of those kinds of things sort of fall under that umbrella of Trust in Food. And so when we've been going in and sort of digging into the research and talking with experts across the supply chain, we've really identified 5 areas that are essential to building trust, and those are health and nutrition, safety and security, affordability, animal welfare, and then conservation agriculture. And so if we're able to address all 5 of those things as we think about building consumer trust in food, we're going to get farther faster, and we're going to have more lasting impact. And so when we think about farmers and food companies and food retailers and others, if you think of almost like a gulf or a valley, if you think about all of the food supply chain people on one side of the valley and on the other side is the consumer, the question becomes, how do we work together to build a bridge to reach consumers? And so we've built our platform on sort of 3 key pillars. The first one, which we'll talk more about in a moment, is the Trust in Food Symposium, and that's really an effort to bring together many different disparate voices, experts within the supply chain in all areas. So that includes, nonprofits, NGOs, governmental agencies, farmers, growers, and ranchers. It includes technology companies. It includes endemic agribusinesses, as well as companies that maybe farmers haven't done as much work with directly in the past, whether that's food companies or food retailers, and really bringing all of those voices together to talk openly and honestly about the challenges that we face and the opportunities that we have to reach consumers by working together. The second pillar really has to do with activating farmers, both documenting existing best practices in the field related to animal welfare, related to conservation agriculture, taking care of our land, air, and water, and then going beyond just documentation to also working directly with farmers and ag retailers and others in the field to adopt even more conservation practices that are certainly in line with what consumers and food companies are asking for, but frankly, what farmers also want to be doing to make sure they're taking the best possible care of their land. We all recognize farmers really see themselves not only as producers of food, but also as stewards of the land. And so there's a great need and interest even in the agriculture community to do these things. The challenge becomes, how do you scale those practices? How do we move farther, faster to address issues like some of the water challenges that we've seen in the Chesapeake Bay or the Great Lakes, or even the Gulf hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. And those are just, a few examples of a much broader effort across our industry to really talk about how do we interface with the environment and with our surrounding communities. And then the third pillar, just briefly, is one that we are still in the process of developing, and it's something that will sort of be evolving as the process moves forward over the next decade and beyond. But that is, how do we find innovative ways to reach consumers, moving outside of people in agriculture and the food industry who recognize the need to reach consumers, but working directly with mainstream media and other marketing experts and people who really have deep roots, talking with consumers and educating them. How do we do that through media? How do we do that through in-person events and training? How do we bring consumers closer to farmers in particular, but really all aspects of the supply chain to understand how our industry is working together to activate change? And so those are really the three pillars: the conversation through the symposium and other events like it. The second pillar, the sort of conservation, agriculture, animal welfare, documenting practices, and then doing more with farmers, ranchers, and growers. And then thirdly, working with consumers and helping them better understand the food system through training, through experiential learning. And so we are excited about this. We're excited to be working with so many people across the industry and really continuing to have a robust conversation around what would be the best strategies for doing this, who's interested in really making this a reality. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but that's what makes it so worthwhile.
So I've worked in the space of agriculture advocacy or communicating, outreach, whatever term you prefer to use, for over 5 years now. What is it that makes this different than any other of those efforts that are out there? Because there are lots of efforts that are going on, and it seems like everybody just wants to be at the top of the pillar.
Absolutely. So I think, Jenny, you're exactly right that there are so many efforts out there to really make sure farmers and consumers are talking and understanding one another. And I think what differentiates Trust in Food is not that we're in a competition to, beat everybody else to finding the winning solution, because frankly, I don't know that there is a single winning solution. Our view is that Farm Journal has a history of working and advocating on behalf of farmers, ranchers, growers, and producers for the past 140 years. And Farm Journal has made a commitment to investing in the future of agriculture the next 140 years by making consumer trust in food one of our pivotal foundational issues for the next decade or more. And that's so important to us because we recognize that there's an increasing gulf between consumers and the food system. We recognize that there are certain proficiencies that we bring to the table in terms of our ability to communicate and educate and activate. But we also recognize that historically there has been, if we set aside for a moment the gap that exists between consumers and farmers, just think about the gaps that exist in the supply chain before the consumer is even reached. I think we are doing a lot of learning on our own about the work that organizations like World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy and Walton Family Foundation and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and Environmental Defense Fund. Those are groups that traditionally farmers haven't worked with a lot. I think that's probably changed in the past 5 years, will increasingly change. But we recognize these organizations are people who understand the environment a great deal, who understand what consumers are thinking about and are working to really think holistically. And I think increasingly every element within the supply chain, whether farmers or food companies or processors, are recognizing the need for conversation. And so Farm Journal sees its strengths as a fewfold. The first being obviously as a communicator, as a platform that is able to be an advocate for farmers. If this were not about farmers, we wouldn't be doing it. But because it's so critical to the future business success and the future legacy success of producers being able to pass their operations on to the next generation, if we don't get this right, the cost can be tremendous, from license to operate for producers to use the science and technology that allows us to produce abundant, nutritious food with respect to the environment. From just every element has so many moving parts. And our view is that if we don't try to help farmers communicate that message broadly across the supply chain, educate various components of the supply chain about what farmers and ranchers do, that education is just as important as educating the consumer, because ultimately people farther along the supply chain are the ones whose marketing departments, for example, are going to be communicating messages about food, and we hope truths about food, to consumers. The other aspect is that Farm Journal has a legacy of working with farmers boots on the ground in the field, from our colleges to help educate people about best production practices, to working with ranchers in cattle management and animal welfare, to helping millennials on college campuses across the United States through our foundation understand where their food comes from, and also the great challenges that our world faces in terms of hunger and the work farmers are doing around the world to ensure that food security becomes less and less of an issue. And so from both an educational and communication standpoint, sort of a key competency as a convener of people, really bringing together people from different industries that don't often talk. I mentioned food marketing a moment ago, and that's one of the reasons we're so excited about the symposium, is bringing food marketers into the same room with people who are experts in conservation and sustainability. Because even within some organizations, the marketing department doesn't necessarily talk directly on a regular, continual basis with the sustainability department. And so when you have even disconnects within a single organization, that can make it very difficult to sort of have a scalable solution to addressing some of these deep concerns about consumer trust. And so those are a few of the key ways that we believe Trust in Food can be differentiated from other efforts. But by the same token, we see ourselves as able to support and facilitate and further existing efforts in the field. We don't view this as a race to the top where Farm Journal is going to beat out all the competition. We are a business, but we view this as something that is in the best interest of agriculture, and there are already so many good assets and tools and resources and experts in this field. How can we help and escalate and elevate their knowledge and help them and maybe fill some gaps that currently exist among these various players to really activate change in farm country?
So you said competition. So do you see that there's a competition out there among all of these different advocating groups?
I don't really think there is a competition. I think to some degree there is a growing realization that if we don't work together, it's going to be to our detriment. I think our view is that we should be competitive from the standpoint that if we don't change our practices now, if we don't change how we communicate with consumers, if we don't change how we scale change in the field to reduce Gulf hypoxia, to reduce concerns about water quality, to reduce concerns about animal welfare, if we don't do a more collaborative job of communicating those issues and activating real change and demonstrating progress in the field, then that's a competition that we should worry about. Because if we can't do those things rapidly enough, and certainly we need to be thoughtful, they need to be scientific, they need to be based in reality, but we need to be competitive from the standpoint of, as an industry, we need to competitively encourage and spur one another on to get these changes right and to do it in a way that is best for the industry, not just for one organization or one company's interest over the others. We really feel like the best way forward is to do so collaboratively. And the only competition that should be involved really is just encouraging each other to make change and to be innovative and to take risks, take positive risks that really help move more farmers toward conservation, that help farmers who already are doing a lot of these practices champion that work and record it and document it, and then use those stories to then take to consumers about how farmers and agriculture and the food industry are doing positive things for people and for the environment.
Another challenge has always been, how do we know if we're making progress? Have we made progress? Has all of the checkoff dollars been spent productively, efficiently, and effectively? How are you going to track that progress?
Jenny, I think, frankly, that's something that we're still actively discussing with NGOs, to food companies, to food retailers, to farmers themselves, frankly, because Farm Journal has been doing its own test plots for the past quarter of a century. And we are firm believers that good science and good agronomy and good animal welfare practices are all things that need to be rooted in science. They need to be evidence-based. And those are all things that I think, whether it's food companies or food retailers, they all understand, especially if you talk about sustainability experts, they recognize the need for science and understanding. What we're trying to do right now is really think critically, and as we visit with our own experts and agronomists and people that we have worked with for decades, we're really trying to wrap our heads around what does progress look like. And I think that's a fair point. If you talk about some of the very ambitious and important goals that are being set throughout the food supply chain, if you talk about an organization, for example, that states publicly that they want to see millions of acres in cover crops, or 25% plus reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, or some of these kinds of things. As we've looked at throughout the supply chain, this is a broad statement, there needs to be more that's done tactically and practically about how do we take those big, important, meaningful goals and translate that into work at the field level. So if we talk just about row crops, for example, one of the things that we are very passionate and focused on doing right now is working with existing industry resources and seeing, are there ways that we can help use those tools and really introduce more farmers to them and help them use those things. For example, there's a really great resource that Field to Market, which Farm Journal is a member of, has put together that helps farmers document their in-field sustainability practices, whether that's emissions or water use or cover cropping or other kinds of agronomic practices. For example, are there ways to introduce more producers to the field print tool and whether it's sitting with them at their kitchen table or working with people in the field directly to really document those things? Many farmers already have added their acreage and are using that tool actively. We think that a lot more farmers should be using it because it's an outstanding resource. That's just one very specific example of working with existing industry partners and resources.
But how does that help the consumer? How will we know if any of that is getting through to the consumer or improving their outlook on farming?
I don't have all the answers, I'll be perfectly honest. I think part of that has to do with looking at the food supply chain in a far more robust way than we have in the past. It involves bringing in marketing experts, people who are selling food, because certainly a good portion of what we understand is influencing millennials, for example, and even other generations to make food choices based on labeling or other concerns are things that are placed on food packaging in part by marketing departments. And so part of the work that, again, to go back to Field to Market is using is how do we activate change in the field? How do we document agronomic practices, reduction in fertilizer use or more precise application or, manage water efficiency? How do we document the data? And then at some point in the future, how do we take that and translate that into a marketing message? We're not there yet. It's going to take time and more research and more effort. But it has to take both the agronomic lens and also a deep understanding of consumers. And I think probably that's where we are most challenged, at Farm Journal, frankly, and as an industry. How do we understand what consumers are thinking and how do we activate change? One of the people who will be attending our symposium I'm very excited about, I actually have worked with him in the past as I was working on my master's degree in journalism, is someone who works at a university where they are actually bringing both farmers and also consumers into a laboratory setting and exposing them to marketing messages and then tracking their biological reactions, their brain waves, their skin conductivity, all of those kinds of things to really get a deeper understanding of how people respond to messages and how might we craft marketing messages specifically in a way that reduced that sort of gut reaction, either I'm all for this or I'm very much opposed to it, whether it's GMOs or animal welfare or any of the messages we might imagine around food. So in terms of measuring consumer trust and how that's changing, I think it's going to take time. I think it's going to involve including a lot more people and people who are experts in selling to consumers and working with consumers, and then obviously robust research on a level that involves marketing tools and understanding how people process information that we haven't done before. And so that makes it daunting, of course, but also really exciting.
One aspect that I haven't heard anything about, and an opportunity that I've seen, and I know many others have as well, we have a great divide between agriculture media and general media. As a key member of agriculture media, how do you plan to build relationships with general media?
That is an excellent observation, Jenny, and it's something that we have thought a little bit about, but it's something we're going to be thinking a lot more about in the future. I can tell you that we've been working with a very large marketing agency that specifically works with large food companies and food retailers that sell food. On the media side, though, I personally don't come from an ag background or an ag media background. I grew up in sort of community newspapers, and I worked for a division of AOL for a time. I worked for the Detroit Free Press for a time. And I've freelanced a couple of posts, blog posts for the Washington Post. So my exposure to mainstream media is more than others might be, but it doesn't lie on me. It lies on actually building those relationships. And so we are very actively thinking about how do we reach out to, whether it's Forbes or the New York Times or the Washington Post. Is it possible to syndicate content? Is it possible, to do events with those organizations? Is it possible to bring, reporters and editors from those organizations into the field and expose them to agriculture on a level they've never thought about before? I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I think all of those kinds of tactics are going to be necessary and important because, to your point, people are fascinated by food, and people have a very limited, typically speaking, this is a broad generalization, but to your point, there's a great lack of understanding about agriculture. And traditionally, when you look at a mainstream media outlet covering agriculture, more often than not, it's about a farm that's been, accused of mistreating animals, or, pollution into a local river, and so I think there's a lot of certainly outreach that needs to be done. I think a lot of that is relationship building, but practically and in a concrete way, one of my jobs as content manager is going to be how do we work and build relationships outside of agriculture with media outlets that can bring this information to a broader audience, not only to the average consumer or, dads or moms, but also, if you think about Wall Street and the importance of investors sort of observing consumer sentiment and using that to dictate how do I make an investment decision, a financial investment in a company or a stock based on their sustainability track record. And so if we're able to move the needle in farm country and translate that to the financial sector, I think that's also going to be a very positive thing for farmers. But it's going to take work and it's going to take relationships. And so, your observation is an excellent one, and that's certainly something we're actively talking about.
Really, it's an impressive program, and like you said, there's lots of pieces, there's lots of people. You also have a lineup of panelists and presenters. It blows my mind, all of the different aspects that you have brought into this. But first, who exactly will be attending the event? I'm not sure if I missed that in the beginning. Is this just for farmers, ranchers, growers?
As I mentioned earlier, we're really sort of looking at the supply chain on a very holistic level. And so the makeup of people in the room, we expect to have close to 200 executives total. And that includes roughly 40 farmers, ranchers, growers, and producers. So that includes row crops. It includes fruits and vegetables. It includes livestock, beef cattle, dairy, poultry, et cetera. Then the remainder of the attendees sort of represent a cross-section of the supply chain, and that includes food companies, food retailers. It includes technology companies, government agencies, commodity associations, food marketers, people who are specialists in communicating with consumers about food through packaging and through marketing messages.
Well, let's talk about a few of the sessions that will be taking place at the Trust in Food Symposium, January 23rd and 24th. You're going to be kicking off the event with food labels and the correlation between food labels and buying behavior, which is a topic that I myself am very interested in. Can you share a little bit about the objectives of that session, and then what is the expertise of Marcy and Mauve?
The Charleston Orwig team, I apologize, I need to update that agenda. Marcy actually, as a conflict came up, so Charleston Orwig will send another leader to talk in her place, but Maeve certainly will also be there from Menu Matters. And so really the issue of, they actually had come to us and proposed that they would be able to do some original research around an issue that we felt was important for the conversation at the symposium as a whole. And so the topic of food labeling and consumer perceptions came up. And, really that's been something that our industry has talked about for a long time. There's been lots of controversy at the state and federal level about how do we handle food labeling. We felt it was a really great opportunity to draw on their expertise. First of all, their ability to capture the sentiment of consumers through independent original research. And then also through Maeve, someone who studies trends in the food industry and consults with businesses about how to pivot to those changes, drawing on the expertise of Charleston Orwig and also of Maeve and Menu Matters. Maeve also runs her own restaurant, as I understand it. And so we're really excited to hear their perspective and really sink in with their takeaways and also think about, okay, now that we know in this particular study how consumers respond to certain food labels, what does that tell us about what we need to do as an industry to either address concerns or things that maybe we're doing well? And so I think it'll be a really great conversation and kickoff to the entire event.
As the morning progresses, you've got Matt Kleinschmidt from Marcoux Matchbox. What is Marcoux Matchbox, and what is it that Matt is going to be able to offer the audience?
Sure. So Matt's organization specializes in insights and data for companies, for CPGs and for others, consumer packaged goods companies and others that work directly with consumers. And so what Matt is going to do is sort of twofold. First, he's going to talk about some of the research that they have already conducted around issues of consumer trust in food. He may touch on food labeling, but we're really trying to make sure that each of our speakers brings information that sort of supplements the others without overlapping it. We've sort of talked through that. Matt is also going to be doing something which I think is pretty cool, and that is that our own Dennis Hecht, who's speaking along with Matt, who's our sort of business insights director who oversees our part of our data division. Dennis is going to talk about original research that we're going to be introducing at the symposium, focusing on farmers and their perceptions of sustainability, what they think sustainability means on their farms, what they think about changing consumer trends and how soon it will affect their operations. And so Matt is actually going to take some of the same questions we asked of farmers about how they define sustainability, and he's going to go to their consumer audience and poll them about those same questions. And then we're going to look at that data side by side in the session. And it's going to give us really good insights as to how consumers and farmers sort of at sometimes sit on opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of how they think about sustainability and trust. And then that'll spur a really great conversation about, look, now that we recognize some of these gaps, let's listen as some of our following speakers talk about these issues and maybe think about what are some of the ways we can begin to build bridges between these two audiences.
Interesting. Very interesting. You mentioned sustainability, and that's a great segue. Sustainability is not one of my favorite terms by any stretch of the imagination. And
it isn't for many people.
I've said that, multiple times on the podcast. However, you are really going to concentrate a lot on sustainability in the afternoon, and I'm impressed with the diverse cast of panelists. I mean, you've got representation from several very diverse farms and growers, in addition to organizations like the Hancock Natural Resource Group, World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then these companies. You've got representation from General Mills, Unilever, Land O'Lakes, Walmart, and even McDonald's. All of those different elements are going to be in one room. So how are you going to be addressing sustainability, and what do you hope attendees are going to take away from all of the different sustainability conversations? I believe there's 3, is that correct?
Sure. So that's right. We have 3 sessions that specifically have that word, and I realize it's a word that you either love or hate or maybe fall somewhere in between, but sustainability in 3 of those sessions. And I think we've actually had this conversation internally quite a bit, that sustainability is something that's very important, and it's something that's defined very differently by different people. But the way we view this is really a sort of robust conversation around agriculture's relationship with the land. And that includes conservation practices, that includes wildlife, that includes lots of things that I think people who just think of the word sustainability may not associate with it, but issues that we believe are really critical to advancing the conversation about how farmers, take care of the natural resources that they work with. We have a session in the morning with a group of farmers sort of across the commodity spectrum talking about practices on their operations. We have a panel with experts from the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy and a dairy producer from California, really talking about some of the challenges and successes associated with sustainability. And then we have several sets of sort of lightning rounds where we're going to have folks like President Rod Snyder of Field to Market, Jason Clay from World Wildlife Fund, Dr. Holly Bamford from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as well as people from companies many farmers would recognize, like Jill Wheeler from Syngenta, Stephanie Grant from Unilever, a large consumer packaged goods company. All of these people are going to be talking about sustainability, but I think what we hope to draw out from these lightning rounds is the idea that sustainability is a very multifaceted concept. It's something that everyone defines in a very different way, and oftentimes the way we define sustainability is in conflict with each other. The way farmers define sustainability, as I mentioned with the data that we'll be presenting, oftentimes sort of maybe flies in the face of what some other people throughout the supply chain might think it means.
Absolutely.
And so part of the conversation and the reason that we're structuring it this way is to really expose some of those rifts in a very polite way. But we really feel like if we're going to advance the conversation, I don't think we're necessarily going to change anyone's mind just from one day of one meeting, but I think opening people's eyes and exposing them to people who are doing these jobs in their own wheelhouse, as it were, every day. This allows people to sort of break outside of that mold they might have, not intentionally or on purpose, just that's the way our lives operate, our businesses operate. We have to sort of think about the things that are mission critical to our organization at the time and get people to start talking. And I think that being exposed to these various definitions, maybe challenging some of our preconceptions about sustainability, whether it's from the farmer perspective or from a food company or a food retailer or an NGO. I think really this day is about being exposed to new viewpoints and really thinking outside the box. Again, one thing we've noticed at events that are specifically focused on sustainability is that many times the food marketers are left out of the conversation entirely, and we feel like that's something that can't happen if we're going to effectively reach the consumer. So we've tried to incorporate them as well. And so that's a long-winded answer to say that I think sustainability is something that we're trying to use as an umbrella term for a lot of broader, deeper, more nuanced concepts that we hope to bring out by having this diversity of a cast throughout the day.
And that's a great segue into the session, how marketers communicate truthful information about health and nutrition. So marketing products, it's all about money. It's all about the bottom line. How are we going to, is this session going to address the moral obligation versus the bottom line?
Absolutely. That's a really great point. And I think, Jenny, that marketers increasingly understand. I don't know if your audience is familiar with Seth Godin, great marketing expert, prolific author, but he often talks about the moral responsibility that marketers have. And I think there's an increasing understanding, and especially among some of our panelists, that there is an ethical and a moral responsibility to the things we put on whether it's food packaging or labeling or how we communicate about food. Certainly, as you said, the financial commitments of a specific company are essential. But if we focus solely on that at the expense of our moral compass, that ultimately costs us the trust of the consumer, and it costs financially as well, because people aren't going to trust someone who they used to do business with or have a financial relationship with in terms of I'm picking your package off the shelf. If you betray my trust, either because of your production practices or because of the way you communicate that to me, it's certainly a turnoff to farmers, and I'm confident that increasingly consumers are able to sort of sort through. I mean, we have not just magazines and television, but we have internet, we have smartphones, we have experiential shopping experiences where you can scan your smartphone and look at labels and all of those kinds of things. And so it's increasingly difficult for food companies or food retailers or farmers or whoever to pull the wool over someone's eyes. And so I think part of what this panel, I hope, will bring out, and I think it will, is that there is that ethical responsibility and that moral responsibility. On the panel, we have people from restaurant backgrounds, from food policy and marketing backgrounds, from agency backgrounds, people who work both with farmers and agribusinesses, but also with food companies. And we also have technology folks with a history and other people in the organic space. And so I think there's a sufficient diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds that it's going to be a lively conversation. I think it's going to be very respectful, but I think there's also going to be a lot of talk about how do we ethically and morally communicate these kinds of things that maybe in the past, absence claims are a great example, gluten-free or non-GMO or any of those kinds of things. In some cases, there is if I have a gluten allergy, there is a medically beneficial reason to include a label like that. On the other hand, one of my colleagues likes to share a story about shampooing his daughter's hair recently and knowing that the shampoo bottle had a gluten-free label on it. Well, what benefit does a gluten-free label have on a shampoo bottle? Probably not a lot. And so scaring people is not our business. It's not something that should be in anyone's best interest. Truthful education and marketing and helping the consumer appreciate and understand where their food comes from is the objective. And so I think it should be a really great conversation. And like I said, a lot of diverse viewpoints that'll help us really think about this issue holistically in a way that we haven't before.
So I have two more questions on that session. How does Xerox fit into this? You have Eric Weaver from Xerox.
Speaking of moral compass, Eric is someone who speaks internationally on the topic of marketing ethics. And so I learned that this week. I'm really excited to hear from him. And Xerox is doing some really innovative things in the areas of food packaging and labeling. And I think he'll talk a little bit about this on the panel. But one thing he was describing was, would there be a way in terms of, thinking about the issues such as food waste and safety and building trust, can a company create a food label so that when it's past the expiration date, the barcode disappears so that no one can purchase it any longer because it's out of date and it's no longer good? And so that's just one example of products that companies like Xerox are thinking about and innovating with. And so that's why we thought he was so important and will be a really great voice in the conversation. The notion that this event is built on being very interactive. And so we're going to have polling with the audience. So it won't just be the moderator talking to the panelists, but we're also going to encourage people in our audience to suggest questions as well via their mobile devices. And so, questions like that, I would encourage anyone who wants to be a part of the symposium, come armed with questions because we plan to make it a very lively event, not only from the standpoint of the moderators and the speakers, but also involving the audience in the process and having enough networking time, even if it's not in the panel itself, to talk with people afterwards and ask those really important questions.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. Talking about the price for failure. And you have Dr. Rob Fraley from Monsanto that'll be talking about our responsibility and the price for failure. What is it that we'll be taking away from that session?
Sure. So Dr. Fraley, as you and your audience know well, is someone who is very well respected and articulate at communicating about the science and the technology of agriculture and the need to invest in those kinds of products and technologies and services that really help us feed people. But, even more than that, Dr. Fraley is someone who speaks as an advocate or on behalf of the farmer. Mm-hmm. And so at an event like this, where we are trying not only to enlighten our farmer audience about sort of all of these moving parts from investment to food companies to sustainability to food retailers and all the moving parts that are influencing how they produce their food. At the same time, we're also, as I said earlier, trying to expose the rest of the supply chain to real life farmers, ranchers, and growers. And these are people who are out there every day. The entire supply chain is dependent upon their work, and no one understands that better than Dr. Fraley, as someone who's developed technologies for field use to help farmers address the many challenges they face, whether that's with pests or with weather concerns or any number of things. And as someone who worked specifically on genetically modified organisms, which of course have become such a hot button for the past several years, Dr. Fraley understands the implications of the challenges of communication and the challenge of consumer perception of some of those technologies and products and services. And so we feel that Dr. Fraley is someone who can really think critically as he's listening to the presentations throughout the day on Tuesday and really weave in some of the highlights of what he's heard into a message that really will serve as a call to action to our attendees to really think about the implications, the ethical, the moral, the, environmental implications of their decisions every day, regardless of where they live in the food system, and really take to heart the things they've heard and start applying that to their own businesses and communicating those messages up and down the chain within their own organizations. I think he'll be a really great champion for the farmer, certainly, but also a champion of change in terms of encouraging people to really think critically and think about ways to activate change across the supply chain.
We're almost out of time, but I do have one other aspect I'm curious about. So Mary Shellman is the former director of agribusiness program at Harvard University, and she has been a past guest on Keeping Ag Real. And one of the pieces that we discussed, it was during a time when Kimball Musk had talked about agriculture being the last frontier for technology. And through the conversation, as Mary and I spoke, it became evident that possibly the reason that there is such a disconnect between the general public and agriculture is because of the lack of data. I want to know if that's something that you're going to be addressing. I mean, we could have probably 5 different episodes just on data alone. But how does that fit into the matrix of all of this as you are addressing it?
Data, to your point, Jenny, is really a critical piece of the puzzle. It's critical to ensuring that the science that we do in agriculture is accurate. It's critical to benchmarking change over time and making sure that we're headed in the right direction. And so data will be important to the event from the standpoint of bringing the right people into the room. I mean, I mentioned Rod from Field to Market, whose organization is very deep in the weeds in terms of understanding, using its field print platform and other resources to really extract data from the field in a way that can be used by the entire supply chain. Jill Wheeler from Syngenta and her organization are actively working with groups like Field to Market and their own platforms to, help more producers gather their data and use that information to really chart their progress in sustainability and conservation. And so, bringing voices like that to the conversation, I think, are really important. We also have a gentleman from Silicon Valley whose organization is actually building resources and tools around blockchain to really help have a clear line of communication through the supply chain about the heritage of, commodity products or other resources. And at the event, as part of our lunch, we're having table captains. And so his name is Raja Ramachandran, and he is the CEO of a company called Ripe.io. And he'll be one of our table captains. So people who want to learn more about blockchain and how that technology might be used to, collect that data that you're talking about to build trust should definitely plan to either sit at his table or visit with him. But he's just one of several individuals with deep roots in data. And that is, as you said, such an important component. We don't have a specific session on data, but I suspect strongly that data will come up in the conversation because, as I mentioned earlier, part of the Trust platform is how do we get more farmers to record and document this information and help them recognize the importance of doing so, not just so they can, give their data to a source they don't trust, but because it's so important, even documenting things for their lenders. Into the future, we're hearing from investors and from bankers that they're looking for this information to decide whether they make a loan to a producer because they want to make sure land is being handled responsibly. Of course, that poses a challenge because you have lots of land in places like the upper Midwest that's owned by non-operator landlords who may live in another state entirely and may not have the incentive at this point to invest in some of those practices. And so I think data is really critical in several of those ways and probably many more. But it definitely will be part of the conversation, both at the event and also in networking sessions. So appreciate your asking.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm sure that there could be an entire event around data, who owns the data, the different companies and the way that they're treating data, who is the biggest risk. I actually have a poll out on Twitter right now asking who you think is the biggest risk to your data. And then, there's people like myself that view that data as a 401k, and who wants to reveal their 401k to people that they don't trust. So there's that aspect as well. So I'm glad that that's going to be kind of intertangled and mentioned at least, and addressed in some way.
Absolutely. And you're right. It is such a complex, as with most of the things we've talked about today, Jenny, it's so complex and there are so many layers to it. And to your point earlier, there's a really critical moral component. And that's really, that's not to get preachy, but it's one of the reasons we're so invested in Trust in Food as for the symposium, but also as a larger platform and initiative, because there is such a moral responsibility that we have to our farmer audience to get it right. And so you're right. Data is something that's very nuanced and important to talk about, and so are many of these other issues. So you're exactly right.
Well, I am excited, and this also is just before Top Producer, which is one of Farm Journal's bread and butter events as well. Can people register for Top Producer still along with Trust in Food, or how do the two events correspond?
Absolutely, Jenny. Registration is still open both for the symposium and also for Top Producer Seminar, so I would definitely encourage folks, go over, as you said, to trustinfood.com to register for that event. You can also register for both events, and you can do so through that website. So certainly reach out to me or to with any questions that you might have. But yeah, trustinfood.com is where you should be able to find everything, and we're excited for a really great week of two strong events.
And how can people find you? Where are you on social?
So on social media, you'll find me on Twitter. I'm at Trust in Food News. Again, that's at Trust in Food News on Twitter. You can also reach me by email. It's nbirt@farmjournal.com. So nbirt, my last name, @farmjournal.com.
Well, thank you very much for talking with me, and I think that this is going to be a very interesting event, so I really appreciate you sharing with us.
Jenny, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for the work that you do and to your audience at really making these issues part of the spotlight. I think it's really critical, and Farm Journal believes it's really important for our future, so thank you for what you do, and really enjoyed visiting with you today.
If you are interested in show notes for today's episode, you can go to keepingagreal.com. You can also find us on Facebook. You can find us now also on our YouTube channel, Keeping Ag Real, and then look for the episodes on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. You can also find myself on Twitter @Jen Schweigert or @KeepingAgReal. Thanks a lot.